Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another online program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I'm delighted to be your host for this program. I serve on the board here, and I have been fortunate enough to do research here, to work with various committees, and to dig into those archives that we talk about so much. Tonight's stories are coming out of those archives, stories of the nurses from World War I, the experiences they shared, and we have found new materials only recently here in Adams County Historical Society. Our collection is rich, and we want to preserve it, and we hope you will help us with that project. We are currently starting construction on a new museum, research center, facility, and library, and hope you will be willing to donate something to our cause. Our facility will give you access to all of the materials that are available here, many of which are still in boxes. And tonight we'll share some stories of things that we found in a Red Cross box just this past month. Our speaker tonight is Jane Malone. Jane is a retired school teacher from Frederick County, Maryland. She has moved to Gettysburg with her husband, and she is a tireless researcher, writer, and author. She loves history, which she taught at the high school level, God bless her, and she has continued her love of history by researching Adams County during the Civil War on up through World War I. Tonight she's going to share the story of the 14 nurses from Adams County, Pennsylvania, who served in World War I. An amazing group of ladies who served in Europe and in the United States. They dedicated their lives to nursing. And certainly in this time of pandemic, we can appreciate the kind of commitment they made. Some of them served on the front lines, others in hospitals in cities, others in the United States in military camps, but all of them dedicated to their craft. So with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Jane Malone by asking her, why did you find an interest in World War I? This is the forgotten war. This is what nobody knows very much about, nobody cares very much about. So Jane, let me turn it over to you to get us started by setting the stage for your research, which I know has been many years in the making for the nurses in the Great War.
Well, my interest in World War I began when I was pretty small, pretty young, and heard stories that my mother's great uncles had been drafted and were being asked to go overseas to serve, and they didn't want to go, and they hid out, had to be arrested, came out of my grandmother's house, manacled, and were sent overseas in the brig, as my mother always said. But then once there, did their duty. They became messengers running between the trenches, and somehow that story engaged me, and I thought, why haven't I heard about this World War I? Because my life was full of my father's friends who were veterans of World War II. So that was the World War I interest.
Jane, how did you happen to focus on the nurses in particular in World War II?
I always look, because of this long-term family interest in World War I always look wherever I live to see if there are World War I stories around. And when I looked at our newspapers, and there certainly was a great deal there, we had a camp here, I noticed there was a young woman whose letters kept appearing in the newspaper. Her name was BEULAH Armour, and there were so many that I finally thought, what about this young woman do I not know? Because I thought I knew quite a bit about Gettysburg history. Who is this BEULAH Armour? What is she doing? And why is she headlining on the front page? And when I read the stories, I realized she was an overseas nurse. And that was a part of Gettysburg's World War I story I never had thought about before. And so I started looking for her. And lo and behold, I found a number of other really fascinating women. Thank you. In 1914, just over a decade into the 20th century, a cataclysmic event began which lasted 4 years. We call that event World War I. In Europe, it is recognized as the event that put the 20th century onto the course which led to World War II, the nuclear age, and the Cold War. The world we grew up in was shaped by World War I, but in the United States we don't pay much attention to it. Our focus is on World War II, the good war, our parents' war, the war we believe made us a world power. I'd like us to think a little about World War I this evening and a small group of Adams County women who played a role in helping the U.S. and its allies win that war in 1918. Some basic facts. World War I begins in 1914 with the assassination of the heir to the throne of a major European empire, the Austrian Empire. Because of alliance systems, Austria's attempts to punish the assassins turned into a continental conflict. The U.S. stayed out of this European war until 1917. In 1917, the German Empire threatened U.S. shipping with its new weapon, the submarine, and in April 1917, Congress, at the request of President Woodrow Wilson, declared war on the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and their allies, shown in yellow on the map. We entered the war on the side of Great Britain, France, and Russia, and their allies, shown in green. The people of the United States, by 1917, were eager to get into the fight to help the British, French, and Russians, and both men and women volunteered in record numbers to help with that fight. Men joined the military, and women did war work at home. In 1917, many American women volunteered to serve as military nurses. By war's end, 22,000 American nurses had served our country. The work of the American nurse in every war is often overlooked. I'd like to tell you a few stories to help correct this oversight for World War I. The story of the World War I nurse begins with the Red Cross. Local Red Cross chapters organized campaigns to recruit women for nursing assignments. This local strategy was efficient and successful. They screened and hired the nurses and then organized the process to get them to bases both here at home and overseas. 14 women who called Adams County home successfully volunteered to serve as Red Cross nurses with the American Nurse Corps. It wasn't easy to qualify. Starting in 1917, potential nurses had to meet strict requirements. Applicants had to be single, white, and between the ages of 25 and 35. They had to be in good health, be able to do hard physical labor, and meet weight and height requirements. They had to be willing to sign on for a minimum of 1 year and go where sent without complaint. They had to be a graduate of an accredited training school with a minimum of 2 years residency. Accredited hospitals had to have at least 100 beds. The nurses had to have experience with male patients, and they had to be willing to be vaccinated against smallpox, typhoid, and parathyroid disease. There were women who, though well-trained, would be turned down as an ANC nurse. Black women would be turned down. Women with German or Austrian relationships, either by birth or marriage, would be turned down. Daughters, wives, and mothers of men serving in the U.S. Army or Navy would be turned down. The Adams County nurses who met these requirements and were accepted for the American Nurse Corps are BEULAH Armour, NELLE BREAM, HELEN BUNTY, Mary Grove, Mary Edna Kiefer, Melissa McElhenney, Edna Morrison, Bessie Ann Shealy, Pauline Sherman, Agnes Smith, Cora Swartz, Esther Tipton, Mary Wagner, and Kate Wolfe. There are some general statements about our Adams County nurses that we can make. They were white, single, professionally trained, and young. Almost all had been trained in Philadelphia or York. One was probably trained in New York City, and one definitely was trained in Baltimore. Most of our nurses volunteered after war was declared in 1917. One nurse volunteered in 1914. That nurse was Kate Wolfe. Kate was 40, not as young as the others when she volunteered in New York City. Her passport application was made on October 8, 1914, just 2 months after the European War began. Kate was the first of 10 Adams County nurses to go overseas. I'll come back to these ladies later, but for now, please note that our overseas nurses are all posted to France. One, Esther Tipton, also served in Germany. 4 Adams County nurses remained stateside and served in military camps. NELLE BREAM served here in Gettysburg and also in New York City. HELEN BUNTY, who was the youngest of the nurses, served in the Naval Hospital in Quantico, Virginia, and remained in the military until her retirement in 1945. Mary Grove served in Syracuse, New York, and at Camp Wheeler in Macon, Georgia. Mary Edna Kiefer served in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and was finally transferred to Honolulu, Hawaii. The first challenge nurses faced was getting accepted into the Red Cross program. If you were posted overseas, the second challenge was getting there. Once a nurse enlisted, it was usually just a few days before the new recruit would be mobilized and taken to an embarkation point at the coast. At the embarkation base, they were inoculated, exchanged their U.S. currency for gold currency, had their pictures taken, and prepared their 3 bags for travel. While traveling, they had to wear their issued uniform. The trip over to Europe was stressful and filled with hard work. Most nurses slept in their uniforms because of the frequency of submarine sightings and lifeboat drills. Aboard ship, they had a strict schedule of classes on military nursing and language study, followed by tests. The only thing that interrupted that schedule were the frequent bouts of seasickness. One nurse, not from Adams County, recorded a ditty in a history of her experience that was very popular in 1917 and 1918 among the nurses. Sung to the tune of "My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean," the words of just verse 1 tells us all we need to know. My breakfast lies over the ocean, my dinner lies over the sea, my supper is all in commotion, oh, bring back the dry land to me. Arriving, usually in London, all the nurses were re-examined and their paperwork was approved. This usually took hours and sometimes days because the ships, which carried both nurses and servicemen, were filled to capacity. With final approval, the nurses boarded hospital ships and crossed the English Channel to France. In Paris, they were registered with the U.S. Army at HQ and with the French police. Within 1 to 4 days, they received a pass called the Order of Mission from the American military, which allowed them to be outside Paris and to live and work in a war zone. They also needed a pass from the French authorities, the livrette, in order to travel away from their base. They could go nowhere without their passports and IDs. If they were on leave, they also needed to carry leave papers. When the nurses were told they were part of the Army, the bureaucracy they dealt with convinced them they really were. 4 of our 10 overseas nurses had friends or family who submitted letters they received from Europe to our Gettysburg newspapers, so we know a bit about their lives while they were in Europe. Their letters or pieces of them were printed in 1 or more of our county newspapers. Everyone was curious about the war beginning in 1914. After 1917, curiosity was replaced by an urgent need to know what was going on at the front. The published letters gave readers first-hand information that came from no other source. For us today, these letters tell a story about the business of a nurse at war. Kate Wolfe, the oldest nurse, arrived in France in the fall of 1914, 3 years before America's entry into the war. This picture is from her French identity card, the livrette. Kate was officially registered with the French government and given the title Infirmière Major. Remember, Kate has not volunteered to work for the U.S. government. In 1914, she is working for a volunteer organization known as the American Ambulance Hospital in Paris, which was financially supported by Americans living in Paris. In an early letter to the Gettysburg Compiler, published in December 26, 1914, she describes some of the war wounds she is seeing at the ambulance hospital, including trench foot, massive infections, and life-changing injuries. She wrote, "When one sees these dreadful wounds, one wonders how civilized men can make war on each other. How can they bring themselves to kill and mutilate their own kind? No war has ever been such wholesale butchery as this." In one line she says, "It makes one soul sick." She will continue to send letters giving Adams County residents a personal look at the impact of the fighting on the soldiers. She describes her hospital as having over 400 patients, French Arabs from Algeria, Tunis, Morocco, blacks from the French Sudan, Senegals, Poles, and some British with every known and hitherto unknown kind of wound. The infections are of the rankest sort. The wounds are so badly infected in a short time and so resistant to treatment, especially where the bone is involved. In a later letter, she writes about specific weapons. Quote, "We have had a few dum-dum wounds, or at least some sort of explosive bullet. Where they enter is just a little hole, but where they come out is ghastly. Either a great bunch smashed right out, or all of the muscles squashed out like a huge cauliflower. Bones are smashed as though one had pounded on them fine. It is terrible to see these poor boys maimed for life." Of particular interest to her are the dental and jaw patients she is caring for, those who have had intricate reconstructive surgery involving metal plates, wires, and springs to rebuild destroyed faces. She wrote, "In no military hospital is there such work done as here." But all the wounded cannot be saved. In January 1915, the compiler published a letter that began, "Yesterday I walked through the rain and mud behind one of my jaw boys. He had got on so well, and everything looked as though he could be fixed up quite well. One night he had bleeding under the tongue. He died the next night from a hemorrhage. The artery under the tongue gave way. He leaves a wife and 2 babies. 2 of my men wanted to go to the funeral, and being under military rules could only get there by having a responsible person in charge of them. I could not get anyone at short notice, so I took them myself." She described the French military funeral with an amazing attention to detail. By April 1916, Adams Countyans read about the honor the French government had given to Kate. She received the Médaille du Service de Santé the month before, in honor of the record of recoveries made in her department, which focused on jaw wounds. Kate had been made the supervisory nurse of the department in 1915. This award was the first of 3 given to Kate by the French government before 1917. Kate's letters are interesting because she goes through quite a transformation in her attitude toward the war and the men fighting it. In 1914, she was mourning the brutality of all men in war. By September 1916, the Germans had become brutes, and she congratulated the British for taking no prisoners. The Germans were no longer human to her. Her sympathy for the British and the French was fully engaged. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Kate left the American Ambulance Hospital and took charge of the American Red Cross station at Angers. She remained there until it shut down in July 1919. At Angers, her treatment plan for the patients, now all American, was to heal their bodies and their spirits. For that she needed money that the U.S. government and the Red Cross could not provide. So, the Kate Wolfe Fund was created in Gettysburg. Miss Frances McLean collected money from all over south-central Pennsylvania and sent it to Kate, who used the money for her boys. Kate's letters are very compelling. In August 1918 she wrote, "We are very busy, and at the hospital they are up to their eyes, over 2,000 in less than 10 days. I had a lot of stretcher cases to make room for, boys with a leg or arm missing who could be sent home. A train went through, collecting all cases able to stand the ocean trip. A nurse and an orderly came down from the hospital to look after them, so we had a nice time. I turned cook and rounded up the strong-arm squad. The boys were as excited as kids when they heard the freezer going. They had all the ice cream they could eat, not once, but twice, and to hear them singing, laughing, and joking, one could hardly realize each one was short some member." The fund paid for events like this. By September 1918, 11 payments had been sent overseas. Kate returned to the United States in October 1919. She used the final contributions to put flowers on the graves of American soldiers. BEULAH Armour, our second overseas letter writer, graduated from the Methodist Episcopal Hospital School of Nursing in Philadelphia in 1917 and immediately joined the Red Cross as a nurse. She became part of the University of Pennsylvania Hospital Base No. 5, which was set up in the French port of Brest. From the beginning of her time in France, BEULAH knew that her letters would be censored, and her goal is clearly to reassure her family that she was well, and to reassure the folks at home that their boys were well cared for. In December, she outlined the plans for her hospital for Christmas Day 1917, and in her January letter, she described both the Christmas Eve and Christmas Day celebrations. On Christmas Eve, the nurses held a party in a large room at the hospital. Quote, "We had on one side a huge Christmas tree, and on it a stocking for each of our boys in the unit. The stockings were filled by the nurses, and what a lot of pleasure it gave us to do it. The nurses presented a Christmas program. On Christmas morning, the nurses were up at 5 a.m. and sang carols throughout the wards. Christmas dinner was served at 2 p.m. and featured roast chicken, mince pie, raisins, and nuts, all served on a table with a white tablecloth. Home folks needed to know that Christmas was still special in the overseas hospitals." In March 1918, BEULAH described a scene of a group of newly arrived American soldiers at the port, which she observed from her residence window late one evening. She and her roommate had an American flag, which they held up at the window to let the young men know that they were Americans too. The flag was like a beacon in the bright apartment window, since it was so dark outside. BEULAH: "It took them about 2 seconds to see the American flag. Well, they cheered and shouted for about 15 or 20 minutes without stopping, and then they sang the Star-Spangled Banner. It was beautiful, and yet it made us feel so sad. She consistently praised the work of the YMCA and the American Red Cross in making life bearable for the men. In an April 1918 letter to her pastor, BEULAH shared an assessment of the Y and the Red Cross. The YMCA is doing a wonderful work over here. They furnish most, if not all, of our amusement and recreation, and we certainly do appreciate all they are doing for us. We have church services every Sunday, and I try to attend when I am off duty. I have enjoyed some very good sermons. We are in a position here to realize to the full extent what a wonderful work the American Red Cross is doing. Everything they have sent us is so well made, and I may add we are making very good use of them. In July 1918, her upbeat letters change. She has been transferred from the base hospital at BREST and been moved just back from the front line. We have been busy up here until yesterday and today. It is the most pathetic thing to see those boys coming in, some of them shot almost to pieces. BEULAH describes her unit and their work. In the first few days after our arrival, we were busy night and day. We have 7 of our doctors, 5 nurses, and 4 boys in our 2 teams. Our Marines certainly deserve all the praise and credit in the world for the way they are fighting and for their bravery. And they just won't give up. At that point, BEULAH was working 12 hours a day from noon to midnight, and that was an improvement. BEULAH returned home in January 1919. One of the things she did was to speak to church groups about her experiences. She spoke honestly and without fear of censorship. Describing her experience in the operating rooms in the evacuation hospital in June 1918, she gave a sense of the pace at which she and her team worked. It turns out that there were 3 operating rooms with 4 tables in each room. In one 24-hour period in her operating room, 169 operations were performed, which required anesthesia. The cases ranged from removing a 3-pound piece of shrapnel from a soldier's body to removing small pieces of shrapnel which peppered the soldiers' bodies. The staff worked from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. She said toward the end of her talk, quote, "There were many happenings no one would want to remember, many terrible things, but we had our good times too. We did all we could to make the boys happy. Many of them were so young, and it was new to them to be away from home." She shared that at the base hospital at BREST, they dealt not only with the wounded, but with cases of influenza in 1918, and always had to deal with, quote, "many men from the transports who come in with broken limbs through being tossed about on the way over." She also dealt with patients from boats that had been torpedoed. These were truths that the military authorities felt were not good to share in letters home. By 1919, they were stories she could tell and felt it was important to tell. While BEULAH spent most of her time at the hospital at BREST, Esther Tipton was stationed at Evacuation Hospital 7 at the front. She earned 4 stars for having participated at the Belleau Woods, Chateau Thierry, Saint-Mihiel, and the Argonne Forest drives. Her unit was cited by Generals Pershing and Summerall for their work. Not surprisingly, we don't have a lot of letters from Esther. In a letter written in the middle of July 1918, she writes, "I have seen most distressing things, but America can certainly be proud of her boys." She too praises the work of the YMCA and Red Cross, and she provides us a glimpse of the living conditions for nurses at the front line. The country has been beautiful every place I have been, but the climb is abominable. The mornings and nights are so cold. The middle of the day is very pleasant. We had rain every day when we came here, and the mud was almost knee-deep. We are living in a tent now. In a very poignant paragraph in that letter, she writes, I have just come back from the cemetery where a funeral was held for 3 of our boys. The YMCA man, who is a Presbyterian minister, officiated. Each grave has a wooden cross with the name, rank, and number on. The older graves were covered with flowers which the French women had put on. We girls had some field flowers today. Esther was with units pursuing the Germans as they retreated from France. In a letter received in January 1918, she describes the land around her. I told you before that we had shell holes and dugouts and ruins all around us. The Argonne Forest is right around us. I was in the heart of it the other day. The Germans were right here just a week before we came. It is rumored that we will go to Germany, but I do not know. Esther did go to Germany in 1919. She served in the occupation army in Prüm and returned home later that year. Agnes Sarah Smith, like Esther, was always on the move. Between July 1918 and April 1919, she served in 11 hospitals. Some were Red Cross stations, others mobile hospitals, evacuation hospitals, camp hospitals, and base hospitals. She was present during the Champagne-Marne, Aisne-Marne, and Meuse-Argonne drives. This chart shows how close she often was to the front. That we have any correspondence from her is amazing. In a letter sent to her parents, printed in the Gettysburg Times in October 1918, Agnes described her work. At one of the hospitals, we wore our rubber boots and had mud several inches deep, and it was so cold that it nearly froze the boots to the mud. It was a tent hospital. We also lived in a tent. Agnes and the other nurses visited the abandoned German dugouts nearby. The dugouts were very substantial. She wrote, some of them were very well equipped with the furniture and bed clothing, even to lace curtains which they had stolen from the French people's homes. I think by the looks of the place, they expected to spend the winter there, but the Americans caused them to change their minds. Our other overseas nurses do not have a newspaper or letter record we can follow, but we do know with few exceptions where they served and their period of service. Melissa McElhenney served in France with a British Expeditionary Force unit from June 1917 to April 1919. Edna Morrison served at Base Hospital No. 57 in Paris and received a Medal of Honor from the French government for her work there during the influenza epidemic. Bessie Annie Shealy was overseas from November 1918 to July 1919. She served at Base Hospital 85 in Paris. Pauline Sherman served at Base Hospital 115 in Vichy, France from August 1918 to March 1919. Cora Swartz served overseas from June 1918 to April 1919. She served in Base Hospital 202 in Orléans from June 1918 to April 1919. Mary Wagner served at Base Hospital 15 in Chaumont, France from August 1918 to March 1919. The war followed Esther Tipton home in a very concrete way. In July 1921, Esther attended the funeral of a Red Lion boy, Private Howard Ohleweiler, who died of pneumonia while in her care overseas in October 1918. Private Ohleweiler's body was brought home for reburial. Esther spent his final hours at his bedside and wrote his last words to his parents in a letter she sent home to her sister. Esther's sister, Bessie Wolfe, took the letter to Howard's parents. Esther and her sister attended the reinterment in Red Lion. Esther was commended by the minister conducting the ceremony for her faithful service and devotion to duty. The people of Adams County were desperate to thank the soldiers who went overseas to fight for the U.S. As units began to return home in 1919, there were welcome celebrations and parades across the country. There were local celebrations in almost every community here in Adams County. A county-wide celebration was held on Labor Day 1919 in Gettysburg that included a parade of veterans, a picnic, baseball games, ceremonies, and a dance for the vets at Xavier Hall on High Street. Included in the invitations were our nurses. The big parade which kicked off the day ended at the Kurtz Playground on Baltimore Street. In one of the many articles in the Gettysburg Times for that day is this description. After the procession marched onto the playground, a large circle was formed, and a picture was taken of all the officers, enlisted men, and nurses. When the Army nurses, Mrs. Armour, Tipton, BREAM, and Sherman, were called into the center of the circle, they received a round of applause from the hundreds of soldiers and sailors who were the ones able to most fully appreciate the work of the nurses, both here and abroad. Whether a nurse stayed home or went overseas, her war experience was a life-changing one. I did notice that the majority of our World War I nurses don't come home to stay after they were discharged. Mary Grove, Pauline Sherman, and Agnes Smith were the exceptions. They returned to very full lives in the county. Beulah Armour worked for a short time at the newly built Annie Warner Hospital in the surgical department for 6 months in 1922. Later in the 1960s, she returned with her husband to retire here. Esther Tipton returned for about 10 years to care for her parents before she sought employment elsewhere. Most of them continued to make nursing their career. One nurse, Helen Bunty, served 27 years in the Navy Nurse Corps. Given that so many lived elsewhere after they left military service, it surprised me that 9 of our 14 nurses are buried in Adams County. In the end, most did come home, and because of that, we can easily honor these women for their service to the United States every November by putting flags on their graves. We wouldn't have far to go. As for those who were buried elsewhere, we can hope they are remembered by family and friends somehow. Thank you for letting me share these stories with you. Whether a nurse served 100 years ago or serves today, in a crisis, they always come through for us.
Thank you, Jane, for bringing those stories to life. The stories of those nurses are stories like today. Those nurses were heroes. They went through their own pandemic, the Spanish flu in 1918 and 19. And they did that on top of the war injuries from World War I. They were truly heroes, and we appreciate your giving them their due recognition. We thank you also for saving the stories by digging through the archives, the newspapers, the letters, to bring those stories to us. I know there's more to be found, and I encourage any of you who would like to help us save our collection or build our collection to help us by contributing documents, artifacts, photographs you may have of any World War I veterans. You're going to hear next week about the World War I database, which we have just completed and put online for you to search for relatives, friends, people whose stories you want to explore. I urge any of you who want to share stories or share information to please get in touch with us via the Adams County Historical Society. And if you want to help us continue our work, we would appreciate a donation of any size as we work hard to build a new building to keep our artifacts, our documents, our photographs safe and sound. So thank you for attending our program. I hope we will see you again next week. And thank you to those of you who donated. We appreciate it very much.